Hello and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today we have a very special guest, Adrian Tchaikovsky. Adrian Tchaikovsky is a prolific author of fantasy and science fiction who writes about history, anarchism, alien biology, and more. His breakout novel was Children of Time, a story about the inevitable clash between a race of intelligent spiders and the last remnants of mankind as they vie for humanity's inheritance. He has not one but two novels on the ballot for this year's Hugo Awards. Service Model is a satirical novel about a world of robots seeking new purpose as their human overlords fade into irrelevance. And Alien Clay is about a dissident professor's exile to the alien world of Kiln, where he works at a labor camp dedicated to a state-sponsored scientific orthodoxy called the Mandate. We are very excited to have you on the show. So, Alien Clay is probably my favorite sci-fi novel that I've read this year, and I especially like how the book's world reinforces its ideas. You have the story of this revolutionary who often talks about anarchism in these very abstract terms, but then it's also set against this very concrete backdrop. You have this alien ecosystem that is decentralized, cooperative, and like more collectivist than individualistic compared to Earth's ecosystem. And I found this especially interesting because one of the most famous anarchists, Pyotr Kropotkin, was an amateur biologist who actually took much of his political inspiration from nature. And then you are also a biologist by training. So I was wondering, first of all, how did your biology background influence the ideas in Alien Clay? And to what extent did observing natural ecosystems influence your anarchist leanings?
Blimey. I mean, I should say I'm not a political scientist, so we may well end up entering territory I can't really comment in much depth on. I mean, the biology always comes first with this sort of book for me. So with Alien Clay, the idea was I wanted to do a thought experiment to try and set up an evolutionary system that didn't run by traditional Darwinian means. In this case, it essentially the fittest in survival of the fittest really relates to how well you can interlock and interact with other species rather than more traditional forms of competition than we used to. That then moved into a kind of a commentary on the way that popular science tends to misinterpret actual science. And specifically Darwinian evolution, because the problem is people then see survival of the fittest as the maxim, and they think, all right, in that case, surely the biggest, strongest, fastest thing is the fittest, and therefore that's the thing that is best. And it plays into this extremely kind of, I mean, there's a whole sort of political ideology about, it's the alpha male and it's it's to do with being strong and being independent and all of this sort of thing. None of which is particularly scientific, but it all kind of comes clad in this scientific fig leaf when it tends to get trotted out, because people misunderstood what fittest means in that kind of sense. So we have the idea of this sort of dog eat dog evolution, which of course is not how evolution or ecology or anything of that works. So my frustration with the way that various scientific topics that I'm invested in get misrepresented and misunderstood on the popular side of things then started informing, all right, well, what are the humans doing in this book? Once now I've got my sort of pristine world. And so I thought, all right, well, let's look at sort of, especially as it was a hot topic then, it's a considerably hotter topic now. The misrepresentation of science to fuel political ideology. As Arton in the book discusses, you get this weird thing that actually autocratic regimes have this peculiar moral cowardice in that they must always be seeking some sort of external validation, whether it is from some sort of religious basis or a scientific basis or whatever it is. The idea that they need to be told from outside that what they're doing is right and that they are right and that they're allowed to be on top. Simply having the guns and the power doesn't seem to be enough. It's a peculiar psychological thing about the way that people work and the way that hierarchies and systems work. Sorry, I should warn you, I go way off topic when I'm answering questions like these. I will just sort of
This
ramble,
is good.
but I feel I'm sort of vaguely within the ballpark of the question.
Yeah, I want to read this quote from Alien Clay that I feel like is sort of related. It says, so The first thing those in authority do, after they've used main force and brutality to take over, is paper over everything with reasons why they were right to do it. Both because it helps you keep people in line if you can get them to believe it, and because it makes it easier to enjoy the spoils of your brutality if you convince yourself you've earned it. Human history is full of social conventions designed to salve the conscience of the mighty and curb the ambitions of the small. There's something in the way humans are wired that means we want to be right by some external measure. I think one idea that I've been exposed to on Substack specifically is this idea that in some ways politics kind of offers a release valve for people's more sadistic impulses. Like people kind of sometimes want to be horrible to people and see bad things happen to them. But also we're so strongly conditioned not to want that. But then if suddenly you kind of have some like justification, like maybe they believe some like, morally wrong ideology, then suddenly you have license to kind of like act in ways towards them that you never would someone who you'd consider to be like part of your tribe. And like I think this is actually like quite an interesting concept. I'm not sure like how much I buy into it, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be observable. You're right. The idea that, all right, you have people who hate other people, but you need a justification that appeals to an external system of morality or justice or something like that. Just going over and giving them a kicking
Mhm.
isn't sufficient, and I suspect this. I mean, you can do an awful lot of sort of Evo Devo style speculation about this sort of thing as to whether it is a basic part of the way we've evolved to be social animals. In that, if you just have someone in your social group who goes over and is violent at people for no observable reason, then they're a problem. But if they can convince you that there is a reason for them to do it, then it becomes A, it means they can get away with it, and B, it kind of becomes potentially a sort of a social glue because you can get other people alongside. And obviously, yeah, we have an awful lot of sort of historical and current rituals and attitudes and so forth, which are profoundly unpleasant and harmful. But they work as a sort of a unifier.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes it's almost kind of like a bonding ritual. Like I think there's some people on the internet that people just love to hate and kind of become a little bit closer as a result. I know the specific example I was thinking of is like there's a lot of discourse around this like I think it was a magazine cover of New York Magazine, where it was talking about like all of these young conservatives who were responsible for like the second Trump victory, and like there's this one picture of like a woman who was like somewhat conventionally attractive, and there were just like all of this stuff around like oh like she's kind of ugly like this like once she was revealed to be kind of like bad, then people were very happy to kind of bond over just like saying things about her that they would never say about like some random woman, but it's like now they have permission, you know. Um, I think let's see. This is not like super related, but I think like one of the themes that comes up in Alien Clay and also some of your other work is that humans are very resistant to letting go of their rigid definition of self-concept. Like there's a lot of scenes in your novels where people are kind of just like they're really refusing to let go of this idea of this like immutable identity that they have, and as a result the participating in an ecosystem like Kiln, where that's less of a thing, is
Yep.
like a lot more unnatural. And so I was wondering, like, do you think this is purely a cultural thing, or do you actually think that there is like having a rigid self-concept in this way is somehow like evolutionarily adaptive?
Um, there's a lot of problems with the way that people think about stuff, and I think this falls into this category where it's basically shortcutting. If you basically have this idea that I am this person and whatever mutability I run into must be external to me, that's a lot of mental energy saved compared to you having to say, well, what sort of person am I today at this moment? And in fact, that is actually how we work. We go through various sort of cycles. We go through, very hormonal cycles, cognitive cycles, depending on what has happened to us, all from from internal metabolic prompts. We will take different actions to the same external stimulus from one day to another or at different times during the day. I mean, I suffer from depression, and I've learned to recognize that when I'm in a particular point in that depressive cycle, I will react very differently to things. And it's still the knee jerk is to assume bad things are happening to me rather than things are happening to me and I am interpreting them in a way that makes everything feel bad and depressive in a way that it wouldn't do if I was at the other end of the sort of the cycle. We are not as constant as we like to believe, but it is much, much easier to assume we are constant and work from that. And obviously it is functionally possible to do so, which means that, if you are Neolithic hunter, you probably don't get eaten by the wolf quite as much, and you probably bring home the bison more often because you're not sitting there thinking about this sort of introspection. But it does then mean that as you generalize that behavior to more and more complex spaces, it becomes less and less appropriate. People end up sort of constructing a great deal around these manufactured certainties, both about themselves and about the way the world works, because it is easier, and we're kind of programmed to want that easiness of cognition. We're programmed to want those shortcuts because those shortcuts have, I suspect, a cognitive benefit in the sort of circumstances we were in when we were evolving. And I think tribalism is another way that works, that again isn't appropriate or useful now in the same way, but we still have it. And it's the other problem with a lot of these potentially once useful phenomena, cognitive phenomena, is you can hack them. If you know how people think, if you are able to exploit that, you can give people the stimuli to absolutely plug into these sort of subconscious structures and puppeteer people around and make them react the way you want to react because you are playing on these innate structures. And you don't have to believe, of course, what you're saying, but you just know what you need to say to push the buttons of people and get them to support you. I mean, one other thing, one of the biggest things, one of the things, if someone gave me a magic wand and said change one way about the way people think, one of the really big things is the way we equate certainty with accuracy. This is something there have been psychological studies. It is a recognized phenomenon. If someone turns up and tells you something very, very confidently, you have a much greater chance of believing them than if they tell you something with a lot of ifs and buts and, well, this is what we currently think and so forth, in the way that science, for example, is supposed to do. But it doesn't in any way correlate. But people will go with that certainty. They will allow themselves to be convinced. And if I could flip that switch in everyone's brain, I think the world would be people would just be much less easy to exploit.
One thing that was a little bit almost like disturbing for me to learn about is there's this phase where I was going to the gastroenterologist, and my conception of how eating works is you just like eat some food and then like your stomach digests that food and then it kind of just gets distributed into the rest of you. But what I learned is actually the case is that for most of your food that is true, but then there's also like a specific portion of your food that is sort of allocated to almost like the savanna of like microorganisms that live in your gut, and they have like different food preferences and different foods will make different ones thrive. And I was like thinking about it and I was like, okay, well, not only is this the case, they're like these autonomous entities, but they're also pretty closely related to like how I'm feeling at like a particular moment. And so I was wondering, like, do I consider these somewhat autonomous animals to be like part of me, or do I just kind of consider them more like parasites or free riders that are like affecting how I act and feel? And I was wondering, like, for you personally, like, do you identify with your own microbiome or not, and why?
Well, this is the fascinating thing, because of course it's not a thing we innately think of, again, because we have this idea of the singularity of our being, of ourselves, and it's a relatively recent field of study. I remember reading Ed Yong was always the big sort of science writer on this topic, and he had an awful lot of stuff in his National Geographic column in the kind of 2010, that kind of point, and that was really when it was kicking off. So yeah, I mean, our self, the thing that we are, is kind of smeared from not only just from our brain into our hormonal system, but from our hormonal system into this microbiome community. And you occasionally get, for medical reasons, you can have like basically a microbiome transplant. You get someone else's microbiome, and it has been known to kind of change people's personality. I mean, this is one of the things when you have people talking about, oh yes, we'll be able to upload onto computers, and you'll be able to take a kind of a snapshot of the way the brain works and just artificially recreate it, and that will be you, and it won't be you. I mean, it won't be you for a variety of reasons, technical reasons anyway, but it won't be you because the you that is you is not just the brain. The brain is a part of it, but it's a part of a complex interacting system that is, like you say, isn't just biologically you. It's got all of the other stuff going on that feeds into your moods and your personality and how you feel that you are, the person that you feel that you are at any given moment. So yes, I mean, I suppose I have to, but of course it's so much a part of you, you don't really think about it unless you're reading the research, or unless of course you have a medical situation where it becomes relevant.
Gordon, I know you're pretty tied to an idea of self-concept. Like, would you in any way be afraid to get a microbiome transplant? Like, do you think it would change your sense of self?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think I would come out of it thinking it was like a type of suicide or something like that extreme. But I do think it's similar to, I don't know, maybe taking some drug or something that dramatically alters your personality. I might compare it more towards going on some sort of hormone therapy or something, or I don't know, some strong antidepressant or other drug that kind of changes the way you feel about the world. I mean, actually, probably stronger than either of those examples, honestly. So yeah, I don't know. It's not something I would want to do unless absolutely necessary, for sure.
Okay,
I mean,
okay.
I've not seen it explored in science fiction much, possibly just because the field is so new. But I mean, the idea that you could basically have a tailored microbiome, so that all right, I would really like not to be so forgetful. I will introduce this particular species into my microbiome community, and then that will basically make me better able to remember things and have a better sense of sort of time management and stuff like that. That's a fascinating sci-fi idea that doesn't feel too sort of crazily out of reach. It's
Yeah,
certainly, I can imagine that if it's not the sort of level of detail that Ian Banks went into in his writing, for example, but I'm sure that it gives a very different meaning to the phrase "the culture" in a weird kind of way.
yeah. I mean, I was a little bit disturbed also to just realize how poorly understood this is by the medical establishment. Like, the stuff that my gastroenterologist was saying was kind of, in a lot of ways, completely counter to what general practitioners were saying. And I was like, do these people know what they're talking about, like, in
Yeah,
general?
I mean, the thing is, it
Like,
is very new, and the thing with
yeah.
with actual human medicine is there are, for very good reasons, a lot of stages any kind of new idea has to get through before it reaches the level that a general practitioner would have access to it. So I suspect that there probably is a lot of work going on this sort of thing, but it is probably still going through those sort of test stages.
Um, I want to return a little bit to to talk a little bit more about Alien Clay. So one piece of media that reminds me a bit of Alien Clay, if it is the show Scavenger's Reign on HBO.
Oh yeah,
It's like
yes,
this animated show with a lot of interesting alien biology. But another one that it actually reminds me a lot of is Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. And so on this podcast, we're like pretty interested in questions of genre. And one of my opinions is that Annihilation is not really science fiction because it has very little faith in science. There's no indication that mastery of the scientific method will help any of the characters solve the mysteries of their world. And in fact, usually when they try to do this, it doesn't go so well, like to put it lightly. But I would say that in contrast, Alien Clay has a great deal of faith in science and like the idea of objective truth. And so in my head, I almost think of Alien Clay as like the sci-fi version of Annihilation. It has a lot of similar beats. There's even like there's like the infection with spores. You have this like shadowy government organization that gives orders about doing science. You have this kind of like strange, beautiful alien environment. But like the tone is just totally different because you have this cosmic horror being replaced with like I guess like a spirit of scientific inquiry. That's almost like a little bit comforting, even though the situation is almost, I guess, like similarly daunting. So yeah, would you say that you agree with this assessment?
I mean, I think genres and subgenres and the kind of the genre landscape always fascinates me. I think that Annihilation is science fiction, but it is also kind of strongly over in that cosmic horror sort of area, which is very much a hinterland where science fiction and horror meet. I think that there is no hard boundary between Alien Clay and Annihilation, but that's because there aren't really hard boundaries in the genre landscape. Everything always shades into everything else. I absolutely agree about Annihilation is about the unknowable, and Alien Clay is far more about the knowable. And so it's got a different attitude. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of science fiction that is not actually particularly pro-science. There's a lot of science fiction which is about science unleashing terrible things, or indeed when you get into that kind of more horror territory, that just science running into a thing that cannot adequately be understood. So if you look at The Story of Your Life / Arrival, that is a far more upbeat, non-cosmic horror-y story, which is still about really something that is scientifically unknowable. The knowledge that they gain and the way they interact with the aliens in that film and in that short story goes beyond kind of a sort of nail it to the table sort of science. And similarly, going all the way back to say Stanislav Lem's Solaris, you have you have the very common idea of just humans meet a thing that is so big and so beyond human comprehension that you just can't get your head around it. But that's purely because the level of understanding we have and the science we have is inadequate. It's not the idea that it is inherently incapable of being understood because it goes sort of beyond the universe and so. And I mean, I do play with that sort of thing in Elder Race, for example, where the characters meet something which simply doesn't work by physics, and so it confounds the kind of the medieval tech level sort of heroine and also the very high tech hero equally when they encounter it. I mean, I've got to say, I guess I should say I am very, very happy to be compared with Annihilation because it's an incredible book. Scavenger's Reign is also very much in that. Scavenger's Reign and Alien Clay are very, very much in the same kind of territory. I'm kind of glad that Scavenger's Reign wasn't out when I was writing Alien Clay, or certainly I hadn't seen it then, because I think it would have been so close I probably wouldn't have written the book. And you do run into you always find that there are other people who are working the same part of the kind of the conceptual landscape as you, and it's usually best not to have run into them before you actually put your own offering out there, or I think you can just end up never quite plucking the courage to start.
Are there ways that you try to prune your media diet when you're writing so that you avoid these kinds of collisions?
I mean, honestly, my media diet is pretty impoverished these days just because I don't get the chance to watch much television. I've got to really, really want to see something before I can claw the time out of my schedule. I do read a lot of books, and there's always the danger that you'll be halfway through a book and then you come across something that, oh God, someone has already done this, and therefore I've got to change the idea. I haven't had that yet, but you're kind of aware of it. But also, that book is still out there, so in a way, it's probably better to do that. The worst time would be after you've written it and delivered it, and you're halfway through the edits, and then you discover that someone already did it. And like I say, that hasn't happened yet. I'm sure it will happen occasionally. There have certainly been books. Scavenger's Reign isn't the only time I've run into something that I was just very glad not to have encountered before writing my own take on it, because if I had read Vinge's A Deepness in the Sky before Children of Time, I wouldn't have written Children of Time, for example. And they're very different books, but it's just that there's enough overlap that I would have probably thought, yeah, someone's done that book. I need to do something different.
Do you think that this, like, I guess, novelty preference among writers prevents a lot of great sci-fi from being written?
I don't think so, but I mean the other side of that coin is quite a lot of the time I will read something, and quite early on I will think, "Oh, I know where this is going. This is going to go here," and it doesn't. It goes somewhere else. But the here that I've conceived of, bouncing off the ideas in the book, is still a valid idea, and then that can become the seed for another book because you've kind of constructed, even in the first few pages of reading, you've constructed this entire book's worth of concept about how the world is going to work and what the characters are going to do and all of that sort of stuff, all of which is completely different to what actually happens. So I suspect that, I mean, all right, so let's talk about ecosystems and ecosystem competition, because this is weirdly, this feeds perfectly into the themes in Alien Clay. People assume this zero-sum game of competition, and they assume it with in ecology and environment, and they also assume there's always this idea you get from outside the writing industry about the idea, oh well, you writers are always in competition, aren't you? And that you're right, you have your book and you have their book, and one of those books is going to win because that's how things work, and that's not how things work, and it's not how ecology works. What happens is everything you add to the system creates more niches and creates the space for other complexity to build on. We're always working within a system where all of these other works exist, but because of that, it generates extra conceptual space. So every book that exists is paving the way for more books rather than taking up space to prevent more books. So I think overall it's a net gain with each book that is written, rather than those books kind of like just sort of squatting on that kind of intellectual space and preventing other books. And obviously if two books are very close, then yes, that is a problem. But overall, I think it's much more likely that there's a much greater creation of possible book space, if I can go into complete gibberish for a moment, than there is a contraction of potential book space with each book that is written. Sorry, I don't know how much sense any of that made, but hopefully that came across okay.
I feel like continuing the comparison to ecosystems, that's also like the survival of the fittest type things is most prevalent. Like if you look at Darwin analyzing these like very similar species of birds that are all trying to fill the same exact like niche in the ecosystem, then it becomes like much more competitive seeming. But if you take two plants or animals that are far apart from each other in terms of their roles, they might have like a much more cooperative type relationship. Like, I don't know, even the existence of just fruits or berries at all feels like something that you couldn't really conceive of if you're just thinking everything's competitive, right? Where it's just like this tree or something's going to create this fruit for the sole purpose of being tasty to some animals so that its seed can get moved to some other location, right? This isn't really like some competition between the tree and the animal. Like the tree wants the animal to eat the fruit and the animal wants to eat the fruit, and everyone's happy, sort of.
Yeah, and obviously, and there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of complexity, and it's never a static
yeah
system, because if there's a way that the animal can eat the fruit without having to spread the seeds around, which usually involves a certain amount of bowel upset, then that's obviously a benefit to the animal. And if the way that the plant can get the seeds spread without having to produce energetically intensive, energetically expensive fruit, then the plant will do that. So it is this constantly evolving system. But yes, it's the fact that the existence of the animal gives the plant the opening to explore into this extra kind of evolutionary morpho space that wouldn't otherwise exist, and vice versa.
I wanted to bring us a little bit more in like a history direction, since that I think your interest in history definitely comes through in your work. And I know I'm a little bit. This is kind of like a question that's like a year late, but how often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Not as often as apparently I'm supposed to as a white man, but the Roman Empire is not actually that much of a touchstone for me. So most of my historical focus has very much been in kind of the early modern period, going up to about sort of maybe up to 1900 max. So especially with my current fantasy work, that's very heavily informed by 1700s, 1800s sort of age, European age of imperialism. And I mean, weirdly, so Mike Duncan, the podcaster, of course, did the history of Rome, but what has been far more useful to me is his follow-on podcast, Revolutions, which I've got a great deal of use out of, especially looking at like the 1848 chain of European revolutions and things like that, which feed directly into City of Last Chances. I mean, I've got to say, I did kind of fall off that when he started doing his Mars thing, because I
was gonna mention that. Yeah,
that I found that not quite what I was after from the podcast. So I will probably go back at some point and collect it all up. But I've been, that one's been dormant for a while for me. But the actual his historical analysis is absolutely excellent. I found that enormously useful. And there's another podcast called Empire, which is a British podcast, which is currently running, which also does a lot of that kind of period.
Yeah, I listened to quite a bit of Mike Duncan in high school. And I think my favorite part of the entire History of Rome podcast, which as I was listening to, I do think about the Roman Empire quite often. But he talks a lot about like the necessary compression of history in order to create a coherent historical narrative. And so one thing he talks about when he's recounting the story of Romulus is he's like, well, hey, all of these things that are attributed to Romulus were actually done by, in all likelihood, a pretty wide range of people that we no longer remember. And he was like, now that may seem kind of like, bad historical practice to you in our age where we have like information that's much more easily verifiable. But he said that like, even though it's the case that we can verify a lot of these historical facts, this still happens. And he takes the example of George Washington, and he said, there used to be a lot more people from George Washington's era that were famous. And he, in particular, he uses the example of Horatio Gates, who is like a pretty important Revolutionary War general. And he said that, like, it used to be that people would learn about Horatio Gates in school, and he was like kind of a generally famous dude. But as time went on, his actions were just kind of like subsumed into this like more powerful, reductive myth of George Washington. And in fact, if it weren't for the eponymous musical, the same thing probably would have happened with Alexander Hamilton. And so he's saying that like as time goes on, there hasn't even really been that much time. Like, a lot of important historical figures have been absorbed into this mythological figure of George Washington. And so if you look at like the scale of millennia, it isn't surprising at all that in fact there are all these things attributed to Romulus that he didn't do. And I thought that was just an interesting exercise in like intellectual humility, basically.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting how that plays into writing fiction, because if you try to write a narrative, fantasy or science fiction narrative of people doing things, so rather than like the great big deep time stuff I'm doing with Children of Time, but a narrative of there are some action, there are a series of events that say change the course of a world government or something like that, and if you wrote that in a believable time frame with a believable number of actors, you would have a cast of thousands, and it would take 14 years and would be incredibly muddled. And so fiction will then condense that. Yeah, 3 guys, 2 weeks, and end of the Dark Lord. And I mean, this is what, and fascinating, of course, Tolkien, talking about Tolkien earlier, for better or worse, Tolkien didn't do that. There are like weird decades-long gaps in Lord of the Rings when Gandalf is just off doing stuff. And of course, they have to cut those from the film because no one is going to quite get their head around why Frodo just sits there with the ring in a box for 20 years while Gandalf is off trying to find his library card. So you do get, in exactly the way that Duncan is talking about, fiction will condense these stories so that a small number of kind of supernaturally agencyed characters will get to pull it all off in an afternoon rather than it taking any kind of realistic time frame.
I think it's kind of hard not to feel a sense of loss regardless when you hear about this sort of thing happening, like I guess portions of history being lost, never to be recovered. One event in history that I think about a lot is the reign of Itzcoatl of the Aztec Empire. And so, like, the conventional narrative of why we don't know very much about the Aztec Empire, which is like, kind of a fuzzy term, but we'll just go with it. The Aztec Empire is that, well, the Europeans came and they just burned all these historical records, and that's why we don't know about them. And that's like partially true, but it is also the case that there was this ruler, like, a couple generations before the Europeans even arrived, who burned like basically all of the main historical codices for the sake of his ideology. Like, he wanted to do a sort of like, there has only been one ideology throughout history, and wiping evidence that there were any like past range of thought that ever existed. And like, he just kind of did that. And that resulted in, us now, millennia from now, just not knowing so much of what happened before he like came to power. And I think that is actually really quite sad and messed up. And so I was wondering, like, are there any periods of history where there was like a great deal of information lost that you dwell on?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really fascinates me, and this does kind of tie into Mesoamerican civilizations a little, because there are so many of them, and obviously the Aztecs are one of the ones we know the most about. The Aztecs and the Incas, because they have antecedents like the Olmecs, say, that we know even less about. And then there were civilizations before that. The sort of the might have beens of history. There's the Indus Valley civilization is a fascinating example. It lasted a long time. It was extremely sophisticated. It had many of the markers that we would think of a very advanced civilization. So it had drainage, and it seemed to have standardized weights and measures. It might have had a writing system. It's not entirely clear. And then, for mostly what seemed to be ecological reasons, it basically came and went, like a lot of those civilizations do. And it appears to have organized itself in a completely different way to what we think of as ancient civilization, because what we think of is like big palace, big temple, enormous monument. But in the Indus Valley cities that we've uncovered, there aren't any big buildings. No one gets the big house. So something is going on there that was a very different sort of social organization. Like they say, they lasted a long time. And one kind of wonders, was that an option? If they had stuck around and expanded and exported whatever their ideologies were, would we be living in a more egalitarian world? I think I am right in saying the Mycenaean civilization that ended during the Bronze Age collapse was a very influential and wealthy and sophisticated civilization that didn't in any way seem to glorify war. So we have a lot of their art from Santorini and places like that. And they celebrate nature and they celebrate the human form, but they don't do the later kind of classical Greek thing of it's all kind of hoplites with the spears and that kind of thing. And again, they like a lot of like really like all but two of the major powers of the time, they don't survive the Bronze Age collapse. And also, possibly because they've had a colossal volcanic eruption around that time as well. But that kind of what if, that sort of level of old history, and of course, then we then go into one of my big interests, which is not human history at all, but prehistory and the what ifs of evolution, which I explore in Doors of Eden more than any other book, where I'm looking at, well, right, I very much take the Stephen Jay Gould idea from Wonderful Life, where he's arguing that the way evolution went is not to do with, well, these things are obviously better than those things. It's enormously chance-based as to what wins out at any given time. And so in Doors of Eden, I run about 12 or 14 different experiments of, well, this is another way evolution could have gone. This is another way you could have had a sentient dominant species that is not in anything to do with us.
One theme that I think has come up like a couple times in your work is like this idea of people sort of living at the end of time, like the end of history. Like I know in One Day All This Will Be Yours, this is a novella that follows a guy who has time traveled all the way into the future, past when all these like calamitous world wars have concluded, and he's kind of just like hanging out as the last human and making sure that nobody can time travel and stop his his sort of misanthropic paradise from continuing. Interesting things happen. So I want to ask, I don't know, is this a thing you like fantasize about at all? Like kind of just being the guy to hang out at like the end of history, sort of like the guy at the end of like Loki or something.
Oh no, I mean I don't think it's a fantasy thing, but it's the idea. I mean, I think that it is the complementary idea to my fascination with deep time and evolution and all that kind of the potential what if of where we came from, is to then you look forwards. And it's, I've always liked that sort of subgenre of the Dying Earth books that you get from Vance and Wolfe and Harrison and that sort of thing. And there is something weirdly evocative to basically being there when everything is in ruin. It's something, weirdly enough, it is enormously a domain of computer games.
Yeah.
So the idea of, you've just got this landscape and the landscape is overlain with multiple layers of ruins of all these different civilizations. I mean, that's basically Elden Ring. But it is also, I mean, even World of Warcraft, when I used to play that, there's so much of World of Warcraft which is basically just ruins on ruins. There is something, and again, I wonder if this is a thing that is very deeply rooted in the human psyche. This fascination with the ancient, the vast and trunkless legs of stone and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think this is purely. Yes, I explore this in my books. But I also feel it's a very common genre trope that people often go into, and it's just there is something weirdly satisfying about writing about the mysterious elder civilizations.
I think what's really cool about Gene Wolfe is by the way that he sets his work, he's sort of able to imbue the present with that mystical quality. Like if you have something set way in the future where people like don't really understand what's currently going on, obviously in Book of the New Sun, it's like a bit more advanced than our current civilization. But there are still things about our civilization that are able to feel ancient and mysterious in that way. And like, I feel like that's part of what makes it feel so cool. Because
Yes,
it
I mean
can kind of
there's the
borrow
bit
that energy.
where Severian goes into the library and he describes this picture without having a first clue of what it is, and you eventually work out it's a picture of the moon landing.
Yeah, yeah,
and which is just, it's mind blowing. That sort of thing. It really is. And he does it so much better than I do because it's Gene Wolfe. But there is definitely something. Also, you can have a lot of fun dropping these little references, and people think, well, is that this thing or is that thing? And there's Umberto Eco does it, and I mean, I certainly do it in thinking books like Cage of Souls, where you've got a similar kind of far removed time where our history exists deep, buried deep in the strata, and there are bits and bobs that they find there. There's they find a couple of pages of the poem "The Hunting of the Snark" at one point, and it's interpreted by Stefan as being enormously significant to his circumstance at the time. And of course, it's a nonsense poem written purely as a joke by Carroll. So.
but yeah, I think like another thing that I think is interesting about these like end of time narratives, like in addition to people wanting to feel connected to the ancients, I think that people also have this desire to like be there where when everything ends in like a weird way. Like I think that people are very uncomfortable with the idea that the world will kind of just go on after you die. Like your death is kind of just like everyone else's death, which happens all the time. And I think that people sometimes fantasize about like being there at the end of it all, where it's like, well, I'm dying, but at least like everyone else is dying too, and my life is sort of part of this cinematic closure, as opposed to just being this mundane event that happens.
This is one appeal of zombies, is the idea that, well, you'll be the last person to be the zombie. I mean, this is actually why I wrote Saturation Point, which is kind of an eco-horror novella I had out last year. So I'd written a sort of a climate science fiction book called Firewalkers, which was sort of desert-based. And it struck me afterwards that the thing about, I think the thing we love about the idea that, oh, well, the world is getting hotter, so deserts, Mad Max, that kind of thing, is in those settings, the world has effectively already died, but we have survived it. And the last humans are living on the corpse of the world and fighting their battles in their ridiculous cars and that kind of thing. And it is weirdly a salve to us. It's much, much more acceptable than the alternative. And in Saturation Point, I decided, right, I'm doing the alternative. I'm doing, so over here, it is global warming, and we just max out the humidity. We get the bulb temperature event, so as a permanent geographical feature, so that there is an area of the world that people literally cannot survive in because of the heat-humidity combination. But that is a thing to do with your body size and the thing to do with your metabolism. So animals who are not as big or who are not as warm-blooded are fine, and plants are fine. So you get this area that is enormously alive, but it excludes people. And that, I thought, is a much more unpalatable sort of climate future. And given that people seem to be fairly blasé about climate futures full stop, I thought an unpalatable one was probably not a bad thing to write.
Yeah, that's kind of one of my pet peeves in people talking about the climate, and that people act as though it's like this great evil that we're doing towards like the earth as like this external entity, as opposed to like, I mean, actually it's going to be bad for like the earth is going to keep going. Like it's like our civilization that's going to be the most directly screwed. Obviously there's like these parts of the biosphere that we're targeting, but like the idea that like the earth as a construct is more threatened than like our own civilization by climate change, I think is like a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, we may well impoverish everything before we go, but things will survive us for sure. And I think if you make people accept that, then maybe we'll be less keen to actually just burn everything up. Which is very, which again reflects a rather petty way that we like to think as individuals and as a species that we are at the heart of it all, and that it is all for us. I mean, obviously, in fact, there are a number of religious ideologies which expressly say it is literally all for us. And when people first invented microscopes and telescopes, there was a lot of religious resistance to the idea, because the idea that there might be something in God's creation that was there, but not in a way that we could naturally see it, was weirdly offensive to some people. So yes, we need to decenter ourselves from the narrative in order to take the appropriate actions to allow ourselves to actually continue. We need to accept that otherwise, yes, it will be an ending for us, but it won't be an ending.
Yeah, I think in Alien Clay, the mandate, like sort of this fascist kind of super state regime on the whole Earth sort of has this ideology that's basically what you're saying. I feel like where kind of all of history and evolution has been just like moving towards this pinnacle of human existence, and that kind of any scientist who has some idea which may sort of go against that is going against the regime. And I thought that was like I thought it was kind of chilling reading it, in that it felt like a very possible sort of
Well, it's drawn from real. It's drawn from real.
Yeah.
Real ideology. There is a reason why when you get those sort of evolutionary, those trees of life things, we're at the top. There is a reason why. I mean, to a certain extent, probably still going, but certainly back in the 19th century, there was this idea of, well, obviously we are the apex, and everything below us, including large chunks of the rest of the human race, are just worse and worse and worse. It's where the religious thinking goes when it can't quite cling on to religion, is it goes into this weird messianic level of science where the goodness of a living thing depends on how close it is to people. And it turns up in very weird places. There is a weird amount of politics in the 90s about dinosaurs, because that was the point where we were reinterpreting dinosaur fossils to make as creatures which were probably warm-blooded and certainly much more active and weren't just kind of dragging their bellies around and stood in different ways and all that sort of thing. And there was a lot of unrest in the paleontology community because that was kind of making them as good as mammals. And the idea was, all dinosaurs, they're reptiles and they're here, and mammals are like up here above them, and then above mammals there are people who are like the special mammals. And it's just this ingrained idea that it's all that's, well, as I say in Alien Clay, as the mandate's motto is, the universe has a direction and the direction is us.
I think another thing that's kind of disconcerting about how science flows into the popular consciousness is that once people have an image of how something is, it's kind of hard to take it back. Like I remember when I was learning about dinosaurs when I was a kid, there was like these certain ideas about how dinosaurs were and how they looked that was changing. Like previously it was thought that dinosaurs were just like these very scaly reptiles. But as I kind of, maybe when I was like 10, they were like, dinosaurs like probably had feathers, or at least like, some feathery features. And then I think that this continued through me like getting to where I am now. And now there are like some artistic renditions of dinosaurs that look actually quite chickeny. Like you can see how like there is actually this resemblance to chickens, because like when you hear that like, oh, this lizard thing turned into a chicken, you're just like, how could that possibly be? But then you see these like very feathery renditions of dinosaurs and you're just like, okay, I can see the resemblance. But because we already have such a strong cultural idea of what dinosaurs are, like the dinosaur books aren't changing. Like if you look at newly produced dinosaur books for children, you still have these conventional scaly dinosaurs because that's what the parents grew up with and that's like what they are expecting from a dinosaur book.
That's just that is disappointing. I mean, I was hoping that was that was at least established enough to that sort of new kids' books on dinosaurs would at least be shifting to show the current understanding of science. I mean, you don't necessarily expect it from Jurassic Park.
Right. I mean, I'm sure the more rigorous ones do say this, but like, if you just kind of have your standard like dinosaur book for little kids book, it's gonna have like what the parents want to have, right? It makes sense, right? Like they're gonna get what's familiar dinosaur to them. But I think that's kind of a loss.
Yeah, I mean, I know there are a lot of completely outdated ideas that still get recycled. I mean, I'm pretty sure someone was still doing the Stegosaurus with two brains thing about 10 years ago, for example, and that's been known as bunk for an age.
Mm-hmm.
But it's I think especially when we are communicating to children where there is this idea, well, it's probably not that important what we tell them, you do get this, right, well, I'll tell them this, it's a better story, it's a convenient narrative, it reaffirms things I want reaffirmed, rather than I'll tell them this because it's true, or at least our best idea of truth.
Okay, so I think we're going to be winding down in a bit here, but as a final thing, I want to ask a little, like a few sort of like genre questions. So the first thing I want to ask you is, to what extent do you feel like British sci-fi and or British fantasy is a distinct thing from the rest of Anglophone fantasy and sci-fi? Like, to what extent do you think it has its own identity? And like, do you think it had more of its own identity in the past, or like, do you not really think there was much difference?
I suspect that it used to be more distinct, and it's probably a little closer now. I think that it's much like genre boundaries. I don't think you could draw a hard line and end up with all of one thing on one side, sort of by some strict categorization and all of UK sci-fi on the other side. But I think that we tend to be more downbeat a lot of the time, in that even when we have dystopias, they can be quite kind of depressed and quiet dystopias. There's certainly a genre of classic science fiction epitomized by writers like John Wyndham, which I think is extremely British, and it's very much there are often books where the central characters do not have a great deal of agency in what's going on. I mean, War of the Worlds, even going back right way, to the beginning of the 20th century, even. Whereas I think that American science fiction is often more dynamic, or dynamic and sort of protagonist-led, let's say. But I do think this is the distinction that's eroded a bit because of, you get... I mean, it's hard to say, you're talking about Annihilation, it's hard to say Annihilation is necessarily protagonist-led. It is far more of that model of kind of like someone who is exploring and encountering a thing rather than someone who is making a thing happen. But that shift of focus from observer to protagonist, I think, is, I guess, one of the main differences, I'd say.
Would you say there are any American authors that feel spiritually British to you?
You know what? I don't think I have necessarily... I don't think I've thought enough about it in those terms, honestly. I think that... I think the other thing you get is when you hit the new weird period, when you hit the 90s, there's a lot of intermixing. And so, I mean, I remember reading Jeff Vandermeer, I remember reading China Medieval, and they are, you can see them when Vandermeer is working in his Ambergris series. That is two writers who are working in very complementary territories, one American and one British. So I suspect that by the time you get to about there, the distinctions have started to blur to the point you couldn't really say that about anyone.
I think when you like in a previous podcast appearance, you mentioned how it used to be that like there was kind of a period of history where to sell books you had to like package your fantasy as science fiction to reach a larger market, and then there was also a time where like fantasy was kind of the hot thing, and you had to like package your you might benefit more from writing fantasy rather than science fiction. And so I was wondering, what are some things that motivated you to switch from writing fantasy to writing science fiction primarily, or just like doing a bit of both? And also, when you write like fantasy versus science fiction, are you kind of actively thinking in terms of genre, like, okay, I'm writing a fantasy book, or like I'm writing a science fiction book and it's going to have these elements? Or do you kind of like start writing a story and you're just like, oh, this like turned out to be fantasy, or like this turned out to be science fiction?
I mean, as far as the switch goes, it was never really intended. What happened was I was a sort of a midlist fantasy author. I ran into this fascinating spider research. I thought I really wanted to write a sort of thought experiment about spider evolution, spiders as a dominant sapient species. So that kind of had to be science fiction. And I somehow talked my publishers into publishing this weird spider book. And then the spider book, after about a year's delay of not doing anything at all, did extremely well. And then suddenly that was kind of the book I was supposed to write, because that was the book that the vast majority of my readers actually knew me for. And so at that point, I became a science fiction writer more by trial and error than actual intention. And it's been quite hard to claw some space to write some fantasy. As far as the difference between the two, I do a lot of prep and world building for my writing, and how I approach that prep and world building differs depending on how sci-fi I am being. And it's a continuum. It's not two separate poles. But if I'm doing full-on secondary world fantasy, I'll approach it one way, which will involve a great deal more making up my own kind of details that I will then abide by. And if I'm doing something that's very hard science, I'll need to make sure I understand the science, or find someone who can explain the science to me and fill in all the gaps in my knowledge that I can identify ahead of time. And then if I'm doing something space opera in the middle, like the Final Architecture books, that's a bit of both, really. You do something that if you kind of squint, it looks scientific enough to be science fiction, but really it doesn't, it doesn't have any particular relationship with how physics works or anything like that. And so really each book shows me where I need to be on that continuum and what sort of prep I need to do. And I guess when I'm doing my prep, I'm very aware of where it is. But I will say, I think that is a me thing, and that is just an indication of the particular way my brain works, because I do know other authors who are absolutely superb who do not in any way accept genre boundaries or definitions and just write what they want to write. And then, reviewers and whatever can categorize it how they prefer, but it doesn't come into their thinking. So I think writers have very different approaches to precisely whether you are consciously in conversation with genre distinctions or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I feel like I read just a couple days ago Elder Race, and
thank you.
I felt like in that novella it really came through. Kind of, you have this right, because in some sense it's like both a fantasy book from one perspective and like a sci-fi book from another perspective at the same time. And I thought like the contrast between the prose worked really well for that. And then I read the Gene Wolfe Trip Trap story as well, and I feel like Gene Wolfe is more of an author who just has this kind of insane style, which is magnificent, and he has this massive vocabulary, and it's super evocative to read. But I actually thought it didn't really work as well for this particular book because he kind of writes both characters in this style, and it feels like less of a half and half. Or I mean, I guess this is potentially not really what he was going for in his book. So maybe it just feels different because it's supposed to feel different. But I thought that was like sort of an example of these two differing styles where Trip Trap didn't have nearly as much contrast between like the prose and like what the different characters were talking about based on whether they're in like a sci-fi or fantasy context.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting Trip Trap, obviously, it's a short story.
Yeah. It's also just
so
shorter, yeah.
I suspect that if you're writing a longer form piece like the Elder Race, the novella, you need to. I mean, first of all, you've got the space to put in more of that sort of stylistic distinction. But also it's something you probably need to do because you're going to be flipping backwards and forwards between those two perspectives a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, certainly there are plenty of like post-tech narratives and so forth where you have a high-tech character and a low-tech character in science fiction. But the thing that really grabbed me with Trip Trap that I wanted to explore in Elder Race is just the idea that neither perspective is privileged, because normally it is that the high-tech character is obviously better equipped and wiser and more able to know what's going on, and the other character just has to kind of look upon them in awe of this great wizard and so forth. But I wanted to explore the idea of these two very different characters discovering the thing that neither of them were equipped to understand.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool using the word demon, and our high tech characters like there's no demons. So that eventually has to concede like, okay, that might be a pretty good descriptor for this thing. Like that's probably a demon.
Okay, well, I think this is a pretty good time to wrap things up. As a final note, is there anything you would like to plug? And do you have a short story that you would like to recommend?
Well, I will certainly plug Shroud, which I think is getting its US release very shortly from Orbit. So that's my book that's been out in the UK for a few months now. It's not a follow-on from Alien Clay. It's in a completely different setting, but it is another sort of humans meet terrible exoplanet sort of book. A short story to plug. What I will do, actually, I will let me throw a collection at you, if that's okay.
Oh.
So there's a British writer called Justina Robson, who is an amazingly talented science fiction writer. Her short fiction was recently collected in a book called, I believe, This Savage Heart. And she's one of those authors that far more people should know, and that is a particularly good collection of her work.
All right. Well, Adrian Tchaikovsky, thanks so much for coming on the show, and we will see you all next week.
So thank you very much.
Welcome back. So, any thoughts on the episode, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it was pretty cool to have Adrian Tchaikovsky himself on the podcast. I know in like the weeks leading up to the podcast, I was like, reveling in it in a little bit. Like I had like a couple conversations with people where they were like asking me about the podcast and just like, oh yeah, we're having like Adrian Tchaikovsky, and they're just like, oh, like, whoa, I actually like know who that is, because I feel like he is one of the few 2010s sci-fi authors that actually has like not like insane name recognition, but if people are into sci-fi, they've probably at least heard the name. I will also say that it was kind of stressful. Like, first of all, it was kind of stressful to have such a famous guest, and I didn't want to like waste his time, especially because he's so prolific, right? Like, he could be writing a whole book during the course of this interview. But I ended up having to do like a lot more prep in like a short amount of time than I was expecting. Like, the interview was definitely like came up closer than I originally thought, and so I kind of had to cram like a bunch of these Adrian Tchaikovsky books. And I didn't quite read everything that I wanted to, but I did read, I think, enough to have a pretty decent pool of questions. I will say that I think some of the questions that I thought of before the interview were a little bit too ambitious, particularly the first one. That I think that like I was kind of projecting a lot of ideas as to what Adrian Tchaikovsky would be into based on the context of Alien Clay, when maybe that wasn't so appropriate to expect Adrian Tchaikovsky to be like an expert in anarchist theory. But I think that I had kind of thought of enough different angles of attack for the conversation to make it go pretty well.
Yeah. I definitely like. Yeah, I think we were originally thinking this was going to be like a month in the future or something. And well, okay, if we even like got him in the first place, right? Just this like reasonably famous author. And instead it's like, like next week, we're just doing it. And it was okay. It was actually almost even closer, because do you remember it was originally on like the Monday, and then it got postponed to the Wednesday? Oh man, if it was on the Monday, that would have been crazy. But even so, like it ended up with this situation, which was kind of like the first time since college where I felt kind of in like cram mode. Which was honestly kind of fun and nostalgic. I was kind of enjoying just like being like, okay, I'm just gonna like spend all day like reading Adrian Tchaikovsky books because I have to before this podcast date. And yeah, it was pretty fun to like try and like consume like as much of a author's bibliography as possible in a short period of time.
One interesting choice that we made during this interview as a result of pretty good point brought up by Gordon is that we chose to not ask about Children of Time, because Gordon pointed out that Adrian Tchaikovsky might be kind of sick of answering questions about Children of Time, because this is by far the book that he's most famous for, and he probably has to answer for Children of Time every single time he goes on a podcast. Now, at the time, I thought this was a pretty good point, and I still think it's a pretty good point, but I also think there's another side of this, which is that Adrian Tchaikovsky is probably also a lot more practiced at giving podcast responses to Children of Time. So, and like, given that he's probably expecting people to ask about that, it's interesting. You could take advantage of these like stock responses that he has in some way, but it's unclear to me like what the best approach should be in that context. So it's something that I've still been thinking about since the podcast ended.
Yeah, why don't we actually, just because we didn't really talk about Children of Time, why don't we just give like a brief kind of synopsis of it. So basically, Children of Time, which is by far Adrian Tchaikovsky's most famous book, the setup is that there's this sort of kind of like virus type thing that changes DNA to make whatever like being is infected with it go through the process of evolution a lot faster. And it sort of like takes a look at these spiders that evolve on this alien planet with this like sped up evolution, and it kind of just like goes through the history of this spider society doing like time jump, like hundreds of year time jumps as they advance in technology. And yeah, it was just like really unique in terms of specifically just the biology of things and how I think Adrian Tchaikovsky's biggest strength of an author is kind of imagining the difference in in like a type of intelligence from a non-human kind of creature. And yeah, this is present in Children of Time, even more so I would say in the sequel, which is kind of a similar setup, but with octopi instead, where they're the like each octopus is basically kind of like the crown or whatever, which is like the head brain, like where their main consciousness is just like not very smart and just like very emotionally reactive to things, but like their arm brains, that they basically have like 8, and this is like somewhat true of actual octopi as I understand, they basically have like 8 effectively brains in their arms that are able to do like the more like kind of human level intelligence of calculations and stuff, but there's like nothing there that's actually understanding any of that. They just act them based on the emotional impulses from their head brain. And yeah, I think if that type of setup sounds like interesting to you, I definitely recommend Children of Time series.
I think it's not surprising that Children of Time is Adrian Tchaikovsky's most famous work. I think that, in particular, it's a lot more stylistically ambitious than Alien Clay or Service Model. Alien Clay and Service Model kind of just have this, like, Andy Weir style prose that's, like, a little bit funny, but it's not really trying to do anything overly ambitious. Whereas in Children of Time, you have kind of, like, this more timeless prose in both sections. But I feel like the thing that makes it stylistically interesting is that, at least to me, it felt very episodic. To me, it felt like a book that would be really good as a sci-fi prestige TV show. Like
That is true,
whenever
yeah.
whenever I was reading the like passages where they were in space, I actually almost imagined it as though it was a TV show. Like, you know, you have people doing this like kind of chaotic space adventure and there's like the shaky camera and then suddenly it like cuts and you're like in this like peaceful meadow that's very like beautifully shot and there's like the spiders. You're like, oh shit, the spiders. And it like cuts back. And you can kind of use that to not only is it broken up into like spider and people in like these discrete chapters, but there's also pretty discrete chunks of the book that are like spread across different sections of time. So I feel like this would just be really good as like an Apple TV show. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Apple TV is already trying to adapt it because they're really like going into the vault for adapting all kinds of sci-fi books. And so as a result, I think if you're really into sci-fi prestige TV, and you're looking for that kind of story, Children of Time is kind of the exact sort of story you would be wanting. For me, I actually don't really like prestige TV all that much in general. I don't even think this is about sci-fi in specific. It's more just I kind of prefer to get like a very straightforward and uncut narrative. It kind of annoys me when there's a lot of like time skips and cutting between the action to create tension. I know this is really effective for hooking viewers, but for me, it kind of just annoys me. I kind of like to just really settle into a narrative and just kind of feel it out and be more embodied and get caught up in like the single arc. And I'm not so much of a fan of like narrative fragmentation. So I actually didn't love Children of Time, although I still thought it was like a good book on a technical level. Now, the interesting thing is I got the impression that Children of Ruin is less like this. I kind of got the impression that it was not as episodic and not as TV-like. And I also felt like the biological ideas, at least, were a lot more ambitious. So I know that you didn't like Children of Ruin quite as much, but I kind of expect that I would like Children of Ruin about as much as you like Children of Time, if that makes sense, for like the stylistic preference.
Yeah. Yeah. Children of Ruin, yeah, I definitely didn't like quite as much, but I will say, in terms of like specifically, yeah, the biological stuff, I thought it was like better.
I mean,
But
did you primarily not like it as much for the reason that I described? Like it wasn't kind of as like cinematically gripping, or was it more of like a plot, like
I think
narrative
it was
thing?
more of just like a plot narrative thing. I mean, it was also it had like another thing where it had two storylines, and I just thought like I liked both storylines in Children of Time a lot, and I really only like one of them in Children of
You only like the octopus
the
one?
Octopus. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, that makes sense.
Although they merged like much earlier in that. So it's
Mhm.
less separate, but yeah.
I also want to talk a little bit about the novella he wrote, One Day This Will All Be Yours, which I don't know if we described it super well in the episode either, but this story is basically about a guy who kind of just stakes out a position all the way at the end of time, and he's a little bit misanthropic, maybe more than a little bit misanthropic. And basically the whole vibe is he just wants to make all timelines lead to this future where he's the only human in existence, and he doesn't have to worry about all of the chaos and peril that was in the past that he lived through. And so somewhat frequently people will just like time travel to his location, and he'll like invite them over to have a nice dinner, and then he will feed them to his dinosaur, and then he will go back and try to delete their entire timeline so that no one can follow him and time travel back in the same way, or forward, I suppose. And I wouldn't say this story was terribly hard or rigorous or innovative even, but I really like this story. I actually like. I mean, I think it's kind of. I did also like Alien Clay. I mean, it's hard to compare them because I like them for much different reasons. But I think in retrospect, I might have liked this book the most out of his books. Um, I think that this book was very pleasant to read, and I'm not typically a romance person, but this romance was very cute. I think that you kind of have this whole thing where basically in the course of the story, he has his future wife who comes back from the future, and he's just like, this can't happen. Like nothing is going to happen after my life. And but then the twist is that she also is not trying to like have kids with him. And so they start out like both trying to kill each other, and they're both just like, well, like I'm not saying that I like you or anything, because that would be like, like get a grip. But then like inevitably by the forces of time, they're kind of just like drawn together, and I just felt like the way that the chemistry between them was written was like pretty cool. And because you're more of like a sentimental romance kind of guy, I just sort of assumed you would like the story more than I think that you did.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think there were a few times in this story I just could not suspend disbelief enough.
Fair. It is a pretty disbelievable story.
Yeah. And I think this particularly hit through the section in which they're like trying to kill each other and whatnot, because it's just like I don't know, like they could just succeed. But yeah, looking back on it, I think I was like, hmm. It has kind of grown in my mind. Like it was a fun read. It was just like a very fun book. There were a lot of things that were just very ridiculous, but just like wow, that was kind of fun. And it seemed really fun to write.
Yeah, that was the
Specifically,
other
like
thing. I think the thing I got the most out of that book is it actually made me higher on like writing a novel, because I was like, wow, you've had some serious fun writing this novella, I can tell.
yeah. So we wrote this article, our first combined article, I guess, which features basically a canon of web fiction. Yeah, Kevin, do you want to explain the main categories and whatnot?
Yeah, so I think that web fiction is a genre that clearly has a lot of vitality, but it's also very decentralized. And while there are individual sections of web fiction that are pretty well documented and well understood within a certain scene on the internet, there hasn't really been too much of an effort to put stuff together into a cohesive whole. So I wanted to split up the web fiction that exists less by form and more kind of by scenes. Like, there are certain groups of people that consume certain types of web fiction, and these groups are pretty different and are often just unaware of the other's existence. And so I thought it would just be cool if we could make that legible to people, especially because after our Scott Alexander article, we just like got some people talking about like, oh, what is this web fiction that you're talking about? And like kind of not really knowing what I meant when I was talking about this other web fiction that's out there. So I was like, because there's not really a good comprehensive explainer of all the web fiction that's out there, why don't we just make one ourselves? And I think this got a little bit more ambitious than I was expecting, but I think that we ended up getting a pretty cohesive final product.
Yeah, so we split web fiction into 5 different categories, right? 5, I think. And yeah, so one of these, the one which I wrote was web serial fantasy, which I think is like honestly the least online of these categories, in that a lot of like the books written here like actually get published and whatnot, those which are successful. But basically, so I mean, web serials in general are just books that are kind of written on a chapter by chapter basis and uploaded to the internet. So you'll get every Monday and Thursday or something a chapter from a novel. And for the fantasy written here, there's kind of like a prototypical type of story, I feel like, which is pretty dominant, and then like things will change in different ways, but kind of the default story is something where you'll have someone from Earth, some kind of nameless protagonist. I mean, okay, not nameless protagonist, but not like super interesting person will get teleported into another world. And the world will have some like game-like properties, basically. Like there'll be some like stats or skills and levels and that sort of thing. So it's not like a video game, but it's sort of like got some of these characteristics. And otherwise will be kind of like a D&D-esque like fantasy with, you know, elves and goblins and dungeons and the sort. And yeah, there's just a lot of these books. A lot of them I think are pretty mediocre, but there are some really good ones. And for the really good ones, a lot of times it's like you might not like know their web serial. Like Dungeon Crawler Carl was like became quite popular over the past few years, and it's just like now it's just kind of like a successful series of books, right? And that to some extent is the goal for these, where I feel like for a lot of other web novels, they're kind of like more intrinsically tied to their internet roots, and like maybe less approachable by non-internet people, I guess.
I think one thing about these categories that's sort of interesting is that despite their online origins, they definitely have their ancestry in some aspect of non-online literature. I think for web novels, like web serial fantasy in its current form, the most obvious direct ancestor is actually Charles Dickens, which seems like a little bit crazy, but Charles Dickens was a big pioneer of serialized entertainment. He would write these books that were one chapter at a time, and he would distribute these over the ships, and people would just be really excited to get this next chapter. But then once radio and TV came out, this form of entertainment was somewhat displaced. And so I think that web serial fantasy in particular does represent the return of this episodic serialized model, where now instead of waiting for a chapter to come over on a ship, a lot of times it just gets dumped into your app, and sometimes you might even have to pay for it. But it's a sort of similar thing where you want to like hook people in and just keep them in for the long haul. And so the experience of reading like serialized web fantasy is pretty distinct, and I think this explains a lot of why its readers have like an identifiable demographic profile.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, speaking about just like serialized entertainment in general, I feel like you can kind of like it is kind of similar to, I don't know, like TV shows and series and whatnot, in the sense of I feel like most of these books kind of start out okay. They start out like decent, and then they'll often like get a bit better for a little while, kind of as you get into it. Like similar to how like for most sitcoms, like season 2 or season 3 is like almost always the best one rather than like season 1. Like once you know the characters and stuff, it starts to heat up. But then at a certain point, it's like the author kind of starts to run out of ideas a bit, or like there's kind of like not an obvious next place for the plot to go, and yeah, things will just kind of get progressively worse for a long period. And something that's kind of depressing here, which happens a lot, is because if you are very successful, like it is like possible to do this full time. But once you turn this into a career, you kind of have to like keep continuously pumping out the content. You can't really just like end your book. You have to like find a new job then. And it's like not necessarily so easy to just start a new book and expect to have the same audience, because your audience is there for this specific book, not for you as a person. And yeah, as a result, you just get a lot of these things where authors will just like keep pumping out kind of lower and lower quality content until eventually they burn out. And so as a result, like most web serials just like don't really have a satisfying conclusion, and most that are ongoing currently probably won't. So if you're someone who like really cares about something having a good ending, I would like honestly not recommend getting into web fiction, because, and I think this generalizes to just like all the different categories here pretty much, is that it's pretty common. I mean, more so for web serial fantasy for sure, but like it's pretty common for things to kind of just like be left off rather than like having a define.
Well, I mean, yeah, serialized things, certainly. I don't think this really extends to the other categories, though.
Yeah. I guess,
but
yeah, if it's not serialized, then yeah.
I think what you're kind of getting at with the like web serial fantasy being less online, I think that like I think it's not so much about the format, which I do think is a bit unique at times, but it's more like there's this other category of stuff that we put in here called internet folklore, which is just kind of these weird tidbits of internet information that are kind of woven into their own story sometimes. Sometimes they're just like sitting there for other internet works to reference. But knowledge of this particular part of the internet is not especially necessary to enjoy web fiction. Sometimes they may even reference other web fictions. This is less common, but it does happen. But you're not really going to have too much of people in web serial fantasy just drawing from like the pool of internet tale soup that you might see in some of these other categories. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting about these categories is that a lot of them are pretty close to like 2 different categories, but those categories are just like not at all close to each other. So for example, I feel like rational fiction is pretty close to internet folklore because of that fan fiction connection and some other things. And like rational fiction's also somewhat close to serialized web fantasy because you have some rational fiction that's actually also web serial fantasies. And so there's kind of some cross-pollination there. But, you know, internet folklore and web serial fantasy have almost no cross-pollination. And I think you see that dynamic on a lot of different like on several different pairings of these categories. So rational fiction is the one that we've talked about the most in the context of the magazine. But essentially it's like you have this work of fiction that is broadly appealing because of the intelligence of the protagonist and or the antagonist. Like I would say that if you think about the way that we describe Scott Alexander's fiction as being hard science fiction in terms of taking something's premise to its natural conclusion, I would say rational fiction is really about hardening a particular narrative that is already out there. So a lot of the time it'll take some kind of story that's often in like black and white terms. They like to talk about like superheroes a lot. They like to talk about high fantasy a lot. They like to talk about like existing universes a lot. And what they'll do is they'll just kind of like harden something and then have really unexpected consequences that play out as a result. And a lot of times this will just result in stories that are just really crazy in scope, and really creative in how they end up, like how that like plays out in their universe. So I don't know. I think that rational fiction has like a lot to offer from a literary perspective. I think that you can trace a pretty clear lineage from these early hard sci-fi authors in through rational fiction, and because there's not as vital of a hard science fiction scene in the United States right now, I think of rational fiction as sort of like the true heirs of hard science fiction. I think it's best approached in that context.
Yeah, that's interesting. Although I do think like most of the stories are like actually fantasy more than sci-fi, I would say. But I agree they are like hard in the same way hard sci-fi is hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a mix. Like Worm is sci-fi. So rational fiction has sort of escaped containment just because of being so popular and good in certain respects. But at the beginning, it was definitely this very insular scene that was created on the internet because of dissatisfaction with like the like mainstream culture. Like I see the rational scene as a sort of counterculture, which is pretty different from web serial fantasy, which I don't think has too many countercultural origins at all.
It's also just like less of a scene, I feel like.
Yeah. But anyway, another even more countercultural scene on the internet is the scene that is sometimes referred to as newwave, which is this, I guess, like dissident right-wing counterculture that was formed on 4chan and other similar parts of the internet. And this is a genre that is just kind of dissatisfied with the politically correct, sanitized environment that was present in like the aughts and the 2010s. And a lot of it is honestly just angry young men wanting to feel like they have a voice. And because a lot of those kinds of books aren't being published, most of the discussion on new wave adjacent forums is actually about old books. So new wave readers will kind of style themselves as being more enlightened and dignified than the, you know, degenerate modern culture. And as a result, they'll often be digging through the archives of really great books from like the medieval period or in the 1800s. And when they do like more modern books, it's often books that are just a little bit alternative, but have gotten critical acclaim despite this, and also take a distinctly male perspective. One of these books is Stoner by John Williams, which I don't know too much about, but it's just this literary fiction novel about this guy who's, I don't know, just like a pretty like straight white man. And it was just not really, people didn't really pay too much attention for it when it came out, but it has since been thought of as like this rediscovered modern classic. People are also into The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, we talked about, which I think we can both say is a very male book. And in terms of modern authors, I mean, New Wave doesn't often talk about their own because they don't have that many books that are actually published. But they often talk about this this French author named Michel Houellebecq, who is like known for having very racist and sexist protagonists who kind of just have some really spicy inner monologues. But it's also kind of like romantic and literary and artful, and people respect him in the literary establishment. And Houellebecq is the kind of author that would not be published in America. And so a lot of new wave people just look at France and Houellebecq and like, oh, France is so based. Houellebecq is so based. He's not cucked like these American male writers. And so the main goal of new wave writers is to write books that are not cucked, which if you're like new to terminally online discourse, this is basically just taken to mean like you're not muzzled by the sanitized things that the establishment wants you to say. And so a lot of new wave fiction is just explicitly inflammatory. It'll just be some guy talking about his very racist, sexist thoughts that he's having throughout the day. And it's often predicated in a sort of like edgy humor. But I would also say that this scene is probably the most aligned with mainstream literary styles, because like these are people that draw most of their inspiration from the classics. So I actually feel like if you can get past the shock value, like you might find a lot there, because like these are people that like have somewhat similar literary preferences as like at least the literati of like 50 years ago. And so I think that this is definitely one of like the newer scenes. There's not as many established works, but I think you could see some interesting literary works coming out of there. The final category or categories that we have are interactive fiction, which you might be surprised to know is a pretty robust scene. Interactive fiction has its own institutions. It has its own awards. It has multiple pretty well-regarded awards, in fact, that go back for quite a while. Like, one thing I was kind of surprised by is, despite being more forward-looking as a medium, interactive fiction actually dates back to like the 90s and even earlier. Some of these interactive fiction awards have been going on since the 90s, and they have their whole canon and people who are well regarded. And there's even like a database of well-liked interactive fictions that's probably a lot more robust than any equivalent for like web serial fantasy. And so these people are definitely pretty well put together. But I would also say that part of the reason they're not more well-known in literary circles is that they kind of align themselves more with the video game community. A lot of interactive fiction is kind of just video games. The line between them is sort of blurry. There are a lot of interactive fiction that are definitely not video games, but there are probably even more that you could classify as video games. And what is a video game, right? Like, in some sense, if like you have an option to like navigate through the narrative, then like doesn't that just make it a game? But I feel like the main thing that distinguishes non-video game interactive fiction from video game interactive fiction is that usually video game interactive fiction is encapsulated in some kind of like game platform, like you play it on Steam or something like that. Whereas like non-video game interactive fiction will often just be coded directly into its own website. But in both cases, it's like semantically, like, is it a video game? Is it not? It's kind of hard to say, but they definitely tend to be more text focused.
Yeah, like thinking about you're saying it was surprising that they started it in like the 90s and whatnot, but it makes a lot of sense, because when video games were just text-based video games and like text-based dungeon crawlers or something, where video games just like didn't have graphics yet and whatnot, like this is really just like interactive fiction.
Oh yeah, I mean it certainly is. Like they claim descent from games like Zork and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. But these are also just like, this was probably like when interactive fiction was like the most popular, because they just like weren't getting outcompeted by actual video games with like graphics and dynamic gameplay and stuff. So yeah, I guess it sort of makes sense.
The thing that kind of made me make this weird category at the end is the realization that 17776, which in my view is just the web fiction work with the most literary significance out of all of the ones, is just not interactive fiction. People who write interactive fiction, at least some of them, were certainly aware of 17776. I'm sure they had to be, but it was not nominated for any of the mainstream interactive fiction awards. And even though Homestuck is sort of in its weird category on its own, it still got some nominations at like the Zizzies, whereas it's pretty much just the consensus that 17776 isn't interactive fiction at all. And I kind of understand why this is. Like, it doesn't really have any routing elements. You don't really choose your own adventure. And it's also like institutionally backed. Like, it was produced by a magazine and not like a game developer. And I decided to put this in its own category called parallax fiction, which basically describes a narrative that's like coded into a web page, and you don't actually like choose the structure, but you kind of just like scroll and the page will like navigate in these interesting ways. And this is usually produced by some kind of media organization. Now, there's a lot of parallax nonfiction because journalists love that shit. Like, journalists really like to put together some kind of like immersive data experience where you scroll down. They're like, well, this number, like you see the number going up on the screen, there's like this
Yeah.
beautiful like line that gets drawn across the screen. You're like, wow, it's so shiny. But media organizations are not really inclined to invest a ton in fiction because it's like, what's the point? Like Vox Media is kind of rare in that they were actually willing to invest in something as odd as 17776. But as far as I can tell, like 17776 and its sequel 20020 are just the only major works of parallax fiction to exist. I looked pretty hard, and there's some stuff that kind of like walks the line between being nonfiction and fiction. Like there's one like sort of stylized account of an event that happened, but really I just feel like there's nothing else that fits this description, which is kind of crazy to me. But I think the reason why this is because you just kind of need a lot of resources to make something like this. Most interactive fiction authors are not techies. They focus more on the writing, and if anything, the like technical components are something they want as little to do with as possible. And so if you have a game, it's a bit different, but if you just want to code up some kind of narrative in parallax and JavaScript and CSS, that's pretty difficult. And it's something that you can really only do if you have a media organization that's willing to back you up.
All right. Well, it's a pretty good place to wrap things up. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.